Okay, I'm John Hardy. I'm one of the organizers of the annual Classic Gaming Expo show here at E3 to show off, promote our history, archiving video game history, what we do at the show. Response has been fantastic. Kentia Hall's often, you hear birds chirping. We've rocked the house here. We have a huge display, 2 separate areas, arcade and home console, an interactive museum. People can try out the stuff, test it out, see what it was like to play the old systems. Everybody who comes by is fascinated. They're all stopping. I had that, and play a game or two.
My name is Joe Santulli. I'm with the Classic Gaming Expo. So a very brief history of video gaming would go something like this. In 1972, Magnavox releases the very first Odyssey system. The Odyssey was built without a microchip in it. It was designed by the guy who's considered to be the father of video games, Ralph Baer. The system essentially is just a couple of dots on the screen that you control, and there's an overlay that you put over the television set that gives you all the background colors and basic game screens that you need. The first video game system to use cartridges with programmed cartridges in them is the Fairchild Channel F. Fairchild Channel F was manufactured by a camera company. It was kind of new to the game, but thought it might be an interesting thing to get into. The system didn't really succeed because at the time there was no such thing as third-party developers. The Fairchild guys were kind of new to the business. It didn't go anywhere. In fact, the industry really didn't start to pick up until Atari jumped into the game in 1977. In 77, when the Atari VCS was released, gamers got to see a whole new type of game. Programmable video game cartridges, full color. They had arcade games that they could play now at home. And it introduced the very first third-party manufacturers in Activision, who were 4 guys that split off from Atari to do their own thing, which of course sort of innovated the industry the way we know it today. A few generations later, really, in gaming, they progressed from 8-bit over to 16-bit, but before it got into the 16-bit era, the whole industry had sort of collapsed upon itself when there were way too many manufacturers, game consoles, and games out on the market. People were kind of confused about what to buy. There was a lot of junk out there, and you had computers that were now very affordable kind of taking over, so people could say, well, if I can play a computer or a game system, my computer plays games, I might as well buy that. The industry sort of fell apart at the end of '83 and into '84, where there really wasn't a game console being manufactured in the United States. And it wasn't until '85 when Nintendo brought their very popular in Japan Famicom over to the US, called it the Nintendo Entertainment System, and the entire industry began to revitalize itself. Nintendo dominated the market, as everyone knows, for several years. And in fact, they had overtaken a couple of other 8-bit competitors like Sega, who had just started doing US games. And it wasn't until Sega came back with a 16-bit system in 1989, called the Sega Genesis, that we started to see Nintendo's dominance split off a little bit, and the industry started to take a little bit of a balance. Sega kind of ruled that market until Super Nintendo came along, and then they started to duke it out like the old days when Atari and Coleco would go at it, or Mattel and Odyssey would go at it. Finally, after all the 16-bit wars had ended and 32-bit systems started to come along, that's when we began to see things like games on CD. And Trip Hawkins, who had developed and founded the Electronic Arts Company, created the 3DO system, which was a conceptual piece that would play videos for you, it would play CDs for you, it would play high-end games for you, and maybe someday even go online and play games as well, which was way, way ahead of its time, because if you think about it now, that's what all of our game consoles do. The 3DO was way overpriced, though, ahead of its time, but the hardware was expensive. It failed, but it did start off a chain of 32-bit systems that started with the Atari Jaguar, which they claimed to be a 64-bit system. There's a controversy about that. The Sega Saturn was in the industry, and Sony PlayStation. Once that sort of kicked off, it ends up with this giant group of competitors and developers all in the market, all of which are here today at E3.
My name is Sean Kelly. I'm one of the organizers of Classic Gaming Expo. This is my favorite system, the Intellivision. Back in the early 80s, when Atari was king of the hill and television was nipping at its heels the entire time. Television was known as a little bit more sophisticated system than the Atari was. Rather than a stick with one button, it was a controller with an entire keypad. It actually uses a disc rather than a joystick, which you either loved or you hated it. I loved it. Some of the games that they had for Intellivision were more strategy-based, like Sea Battle. Sea Battle used, you can pick from a bunch of different ships, about 12 different ships, try and invade your opponent's base and take it over. The sports games is what Intellivision was most known for. Boxing, baseball, pretty much all of them were 2 players. A lot of different options because of the controllers. And technically, Intellivision is actually a 16-bit system, believe it or not, as opposed to Atari, which was 8-bit. But even today, Intellivision is, I don't know if you spoke with Intellivision Productions, they're releasing a lot of the old Intellivision games on modern platforms, Xbox, PS2, PC. You know, it's all real popular.
Well, this is where it all began. This was Ralph Baer's dream and creation to put home video games on a television set, have video games played by somebody on a box. The brown box, as he called it, became the model for the Odyssey that Magnavox produced in 1972, which is the beginning of the video game industry's home console.
My favorite machine would have to be the Atari 800 computer. It's one of Atari's first models. They're 800, they also had a 400 line. It's the architecture of it was so solid and advanced for its time that basically Atari built their entire 8-bit product throughout the years, up into the 90s, was all based on this machine with minor modifications. It's one of the best game machines that are out there. Most people don't think of computers as game machines. But honestly, at the time, for arcade conversions, Pac-Man, those types of games, this machine was doing spot-on conversions at the time, and other stuff the home consoles, you know, the 2600, 5200 couldn't do.
So fast forward to 1983, the game industry has seen a number of different types of 8-bit consoles before, by Atari and Coleco and Odyssey and Magnavox. But what they hadn't seen before was a system that kind of stood on its own and was able to play. Now GCE had this great idea to create a console that you could just carry around with you like a piece of luggage. But what's really innovative about it, besides the fact that it plays cartridges, is that it's vector graphics, which made it look like an arcade game pretty much right out of the box. Nobody else had tried it before or since, actually. So you would put the cartridge in like you would with any other game system, fire it up, and then every one of the games came with its own little color overlay that you could snap into place, which made it look even more like the arcade game because, if I can get this in right, because now it's an actual arcade screen like Scramble. So now I know what all these buttons do. It's so complicated. Fire. And I know player 1 and player 2 score up on the top as well, just like an arcade machine. Now, unfortunately, it was a bit of a victim of that crash that happened in 1984 because there were so many consoles out and consumers had spent all of their money on games. This came out at a very high price. It wasn't a little too much for people to stomach at the time when the industry was sort of failing and died an early death. But today, this is a very highly sought after item. It's not necessarily rare, but because it's difficult to ship and it's difficult to just come across in the wild, game collectors and big-time players just look for this. Everyone looks for it.
The Pong you see here is one of the first versions. It was loaned to us by a good friend of us, Jerry Jessup, who works at Sony, especially for this display. It's from his private collection. This unit was the first commercially successful video game that was ever produced in any amount of quantity. The old story is that the original units were put out at very few places. The unit in particular, the most famous one, was put at a bar called Andy Capp's back in the day. They got a call that the machine was broken. They came down, they opened the door, and the credits, you know, they had an old bread pan and it just filled up with coins, shorted it out. So it was just a tremendous success.
The rarest piece that we have here at our little exhibit here at E3 is the computer space machine. It was the very first stand-up arcade game ever made. It's basically a black and white ships shooting at each other where you controlled it with a series of buttons. It has an incredibly unusual design, which I hope you'll take shots of. Nothing's been done quite like it ever since. It's all made out of fiberglass, and there was only a couple thousand of the machines ever made. It wasn't a terrible success in any way, but it kind of got things started. Of those 1,000 or so, we believe we have piece number 1. So we should have on picture here the very first of the very first.